40 years ago this past spring, a group of University of Minnesota students took a stand when administrators ignored their pleas to create a new academic unit at the University of Minnesota that would focus on African American cultural issues. This is their story.
The late 1960s was a time of monumental change in America. Throughout the decade, protests, peaceful and otherwise, drew attention to a variety of social issues from the Vietnam War to civil rights. On college campuses throughout the country, students took to the streets to vent their frustrations with the status quo. 40 years ago at the University of Minnesota, civil disobedience gave birth to a new academic department. In the spring of 1969, African American students seized control of the university's administration building, Morrill Hall. Professor James Wright was a graduate student at the U and took part in the takeover.
After Dr. King's assassination, again on Friday of April 4th in 1968, that evening, of course, the riots and disorders sprang out in cities around the country. Over 150 nationwide were major disturbances. And the members of our student group met that following Monday to decide what our response was going to be to this turn of events, to Dr. King's assassination and to the civil disorders. And we ultimately decided we wanted to make a constructive response that would respect the legacy of Dr. King. And it was in that context that we framed the demands that ultimately were issued to the administration of the university. I was the lone graduate student in the organization at the time. I was a beginning graduate student. I drafted the original 7 demands that we presented to President Malcolm Moose's administration the following week. Well, the demands, if one looks at them now, in retrospect, they look, I think most observers have agreed, eminently reasonable. They were not an effort to subvert or destroy this institution. And some of the leading demands involved, again, the creation of scholarships for African American and low-income students. At least 200 scholarships, the original demands called for. It also called for the university to create admissions policies and advising and counseling support students for black students and students of color and the underprivileged. That would lead ultimately to the creation of the Martin Luther King Jr. program in the College of Liberal Arts, and to some programs in other colleges, again, that like the General College, so forth, that addressed this, the same student body. A third major demand was that the curriculum of the university ought to reflect the contributions of African Americans to the culture and history of this country, which it did not. And that demand, when operationalized, led to the creation of a department of Afro-American and African studies.
The students' demands went unanswered. Efforts to negotiate with the university's administration were met with indifference, prompting the students to take decisive action.
After New Year's, when we met again with the administration representatives, in fact the day before the takeover was called, it was clear that there was going to be no substantive action on any of the demands. And it was at that point it was decided that direct action, civil disobedience, and the takeover of the administration building was the course that we had to take.
Then University President Malcolm Moose brokered a deal with the students the night of the Morrill Hall takeover that led to the creation of a Department of African American Studies.
Well, the department, like many of its fellow departments around the country, had a number of issues to face at the outset. These were new entities in these kinds of institutions, large public land-grant institutions like the University of Minnesota and some of the other Big Ten schools. This was a new experience, and so there was a good deal of, I think, uncertainty about how best to proceed, about whether, in fact, we ought to be creating departments with tenured core faculty or programs with a looser administrative structure, but perhaps less permanence and less well protected. There were questions about what, in fact, the content of of a major ought to be, what kind of courses ought to be taught, who ought to teach them, and so forth. All these things had to be navigated, and we were doing this again in a context in which there was no significant faculty presence of specialists in African American studies. There were some specialists in African studies already at the university in some of the traditional departments. Ultimately, I think we've fairly successfully navigated all of those uncertainties, created a coherent program for departmental majors, brought in the specialists in African culture and African studies into a mix with scholars in African American studies, and created a program that has, been able to adapt to changing frames of reference and changing material circumstances and changing administrative missions over the course of the years. And again, we have had scholars across the array of humanities and social science disciplines over the course of the years. We have been one of the few graduate research universities to produce a program that has also helped develop a graduate affiliated enterprise, the History of African Peoples program in the History Department, that made it possible to pursue graduate MA and PhD degrees, and so on.
Much has changed since 1969, and the university is now a far more diverse institution. Wright says the department is looking to expand its mission while maintaining the goals that resulted in its creation 40 years ago.
At this point in time, again, as we face the 21st century here, and changing environment, a changing economic marketplace for students who have to think about their professional futures, about getting jobs, and so forth, as well as broadening their experience of the world. We have increasingly emphasizing the need both to develop global perspectives on issues that we address in classrooms and community forums around African and African American studies, as well as, again, the question of providing students with the kind of marketable skills, adaptable marketable skills, because, of course, the idea of the single job career is an artifact now of the past, and students need to develop a kind of liberal, and that sense I mean liberating education that will enable them to adapt to the continuing kinds of shocks in the marketplace and changes in the political and cultural world that we face. The fact that, again, we as a nation are in the process of, we're heading toward the point in which the white population will become a minority in America, and people of color will outnumber whites, and the old dialogue of majority and minority will no longer be functional or realistic, and there will be a necessary adjustment in order and how we deal with that change. In parts of the country, that's already a fact. It's already a reality. And in some ways, rethinking what it means to be an American and dealing with a continuing debate we've had since the founding of the nation between a view of America as some kind of a homogenizing melting pot on the one hand, modeled on the values and ideals and cultures and traditions of a dominant Anglo-American elite, versus a pluralistic vision of this as a culture, a people of people, a nation of nations, inevitably diverse and plural, all right? Many and not just one. Yeah, that's going to be a continuing issue, and we have to equip students to be able to deal with that continuing paradox of American life.
When Access Minnesota returns, some advice on how to make winter in Minnesota more fun.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.